The fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical song above Trauma Bay 3, casting everything in the pale blue-white of a hospital midnight. Rachel Torres moved through the space with the kind of quiet efficiency that made her disappear, which was exactly how she wanted it. The night shift at Sacred Heart in Jacksonville had a rhythm all its own, the wheeze of ventilators, the soft beep of monitors counting heartbeats in the dark, the squeak of her white nursing clogs against linoleum worn smooth by 18 years of footsteps. Not all of them hers. Some were ghosts. She checked the 4-line on the patient in Bay 2, her hand steady as surgical steel as she adjusted the flow rate. The tremor that used to visit her hands after long deployments had faded years ago. What remained was muscle memory masquerading as muscle, movement so precise they looked effortless. A resident passing through the corridor glanced at her but didn't see her, just another temp nurse in the graveyard shift rotation, the kind of face hospitals cycled through without learning names. Rachel liked it that way. She had spent enough time being seen. The ER doors burst open at 11:47 p.m. with the sound of controlled chaos, paramedics calling vitals, a stretcher rail clattering, boots on wet tile. An unconscious male, mid-40s, laceration across the left temporal lobe, no wallet in his pockets. No phone. No identification. The paramedics had already checked twice. Found him on the overpass on San Marco Avenue, the lead medic said, running alongside the stretcher. Single vehicle accident. Ejected through the windshield. Found him 15 meters from the car, no ID on him. Nothing but the clothes he was wearing. Rachel stepped back as the trauma team swarmed, the choreography of an ER taking in a mystery. Dr. Garrison was on call tonight, competent and steady, already calling for a trauma panel and a CT scan. The patient was wheeled into Bay 3, stripped down to his skin under the harsh lights, his body a map of old scars and new trauma. Surgical scars. Precise ones. Training scars. The kind that come from doing the same dangerous thing over and over until your body forgets how to do anything else. Rachel moved to the corner, pulling on fresh gloves, preparing the monitor leads. Routine. Invisible. She had been trained for this, move through a space, do the work, disappear. But her eyes lingered on the patient's left boot, still laced tight despite the impact. Something caught light inside it. Metal. She registered it without showing it, the way you catalog details when details matter. After Dr. Garrison had stabilized the vitals and the patient was sent upstairs for imaging, Rachel began the standard post-trauma cleanup. Bloody gauze into the medical waste. Used equipment logged and catalogued. She worked alone in the bay, the other night nurses were managing the waiting room, the usual parade of fevers and chest pains and people who had decided 2 a.m. was the best time to discover they might be dying. She reached for the patient's boot. Procedure was to secure personal effects, log them, store them. But her fingers found something before she found the official pocket. A small edge of laminate tucked into the interior where the laces tied off. Her breath didn't change. Her hands didn't hesitate. She extracted it with the same methodical care she used for everything, a military ID card, the laminate worn soft from being carried in a pocket that had seen a lot of miles. The name on it was John Mercer. The rank was sergeant. The unit designation made her pause for one long second, 3rd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment. Her regiment. The unit she had left 6 years ago with an honorable discharge and a decision to become someone else entirely. Under the ID, deeper in the boot, she found trauma shears. Military issue, the handles worn from use, the blade still sharp. Engraved on the metal shaft in careful block letters was a call sign she didn't recognize, Night Owl. Rachel held the shears for exactly 3 seconds. Then she logged them both, ID and shears, into the patient property system, her keystrokes precise and even, her face utterly blank. The patient's name was recorded now. John Mercer. 75th Rangers. Someone would notify his unit in the morning. Someone would track down his family. Someone would tell them a ranger had fallen off an overpass and cracked his head open on Jacksonville asphalt. She finished her shift at 7 a.m. without deviating from routine. Report of the day, nurse. Stack of charts. Verbal handoff. 3 fresh patients admitted overnight, 1 discharged, Mercer still stable but still unconscious upstairs in the ICU. She did not mention the military ID. She did not mention the shears. That information was already in the system, officially logged, no longer her responsibility. The morning sun hit her face as she walked through the ER exit, the air already thick with Florida humidity. 6 years ago, when she had signed the discharge papers at Fort Benning, she had made a decision: she would be Rachel Torres, civilian nurse, and that would be enough. She had trained for 18 years to do 2 things at the highest level of competence: kill and heal. The military had needed the first skill. Nursing needed the second. It seemed like a clean trade-off. An escape route disguised as a career change. She had genuinely wanted to be invisible. To move through rooms without the weight of what she had done pressing down like a physical force. To go to work at Sacred Heart and be just another temp on the rotation, unremarkable, forgettable, safe. No one asking questions about scars or calluses or why her hands moved with such precision when she worked. No one needing her to be more than she was pretending to be. But then the hospital had hired Dr. Ashford 6 months ago. She noticed him first in the supply room, running his finger along the inventory manifest with the focus of someone counting money. He had the look of expensive education and inherited confidence, the kind of face that had never been told no. His suit cost more than her weekly paycheck. His watch probably cost more than her monthly one. The way he moved through the hospital corridors suggested he believed he owned them, or soon would. The supply chain discrepancies had started small. Rachel caught the first one while logging equipment after a trauma. The order for Level 1 rapid infusers was marked for 18 units, but only 12 had arrived. The paperwork was signed off on anyway. She mentioned it to the supply manager. He had shrugged and told her not to worry about things above her pay grade. That phrase became familiar. Above her pay grade. Like she was supposed to stay in her lane, eyes down, mouth shut. But 18 years of training meant you noticed inconsistencies. You noticed patterns. You noticed when the vendor invoices didn't match the received goods. You noticed when the same supply company kept getting approved for orders at premium rates despite better alternatives existing. You noticed when a certain physician seemed very interested in which vendor got which contract. Dr. Ashford had caught her noticing. She had been standing in the supply corridor at 6:15 a.m., comparing the previous month's invoices to the current shipment manifest, when his voice came from behind her like a scalpel. Thinking about a career change into accounting, he had said, his tone light and pleasant and threaded with something else. Something predatory. Rachel had looked up, her face neutral. Just checking the inventory. For a temp. His smile was all teeth. That's ambitious. She had said nothing. She had simply logged the manifest and moved past him, aware of how his eyes tracked her, aware that she had just crossed some kind of line without understanding the rules of the game being played. It was only later, sitting alone in her car in the hospital parking lot before her shift, that she allowed herself to grip the steering wheel hard enough to feel the tremor in her forearms. Not fear. Never fear. After Tikrit, after everything that had happened there, fear was just data. Pain was information. The tremor was just her body processing that she had made a mistake coming here, thinking she could bury this life and walk away from it. The rain started as she sat there, hammering the windshield like applause, and she closed her eyes and let it wash over the glass while she waited for her courage to return. It always did. That was the thing about training, it became who you were, not just what you could do. She had chosen this life as a nurse because she genuinely wanted to heal people. She had chosen Jacksonville and the night shift and the invisibility because she had genuinely wanted peace. But something had arrived in Trauma Bay 3 tonight that changed the equation. A man from her past, unconscious and bleeding and wearing the call sign of someone she didn't know, carrying shears that meant he had done the work after she left. The work she had given 18 years to perfecting. And now there was a man in an expensive suit who seemed very interested in making sure she didn't stay long enough to ask uncomfortable questions. But that wasn't the worst part. The staff meeting had started at 7 in the morning, which meant Rachel had been awake for 23 straight hours. Night shift to day shift overlap, a scheduling choice made by administrators who had never worked both. She sat in the back of the conference room at Sacred Heart, her scrub still damp with someone else's blood, her mind already 3 steps ahead to the supply inventory she needed to complete before clocking out. Dr. Ashford stood at the front of the room with his arms crossed, his suit the color of fresh concrete, his smile precisely calibrated to convey authority without warmth. The 2 board members flanking him, Castleton and Hayes, both men who golfed on Thursdays, looked bored. Rachel had learned their names by listening to the doctor's lounge conversations. The kind of listening that made her invisible. "Let's talk about clinical judgment," Ashford said, his voice carrying the particular edge of a man who had decided something. "Rachel! Stand up!" She stood. The room shifted. 37 pairs of eyes turned. She felt them the way soldiers feel incoming fire, not on her skin, but somewhere deeper, a pressure change in the air. "Quick question. Patient presents with hemodynamic instability, BP 72/40, heart rate 118. Breath sounds diminished on the right. What's your first move?" Her jaw tightened. "Fractionally. Measurably." But her voice came out level. "Needle decompression." "Wrong." He smiled. "Wrong patient, wrong priority. You'd kill him. Needle decompression at the second intercostal space." I said wrong. He turned to the room. "Does anyone here want Rachel deciding their care? Anyone? No? Good." He looked back at her. His eyes had the flat certainty of a man who had never been challenged. Next scenario. Pediatric patient, 6 years old, stridor, altered mental status. You have 2 minutes before complete airway compromise. Go. Secure the airway. Size 4.0 endotracheal tube. Consider emergency cricothyrotomy if you just killed a child. Ashford's voice remained conversational. Cricothyrotomy on a 6-year-old. You're not even trained for that. He let it hang. The room had gone so quiet she could hear the fluorescent lights humming their electric prayer. Third scenario. Bilateral pneumothorax, both lungs. Minute-by-minute blood loss. What's your play? Rachel didn't answer. She had learned something in the desert that doctors learned too late. Sometimes the answer was knowing when to stop talking. That's what I thought. Ashford nodded at Castleton, who made a note on his tablet. Impaired decision-making under pressure. We should document that. She sat down. Her hand stayed flat on the table. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. The kind of restraint that had kept her alive through 2 tours of Helmand Province and 3 months of treating casualties whose wounds told stories her civilian colleagues would never have to imagine. But Ashford wouldn't understand that. He had never been the person who had to decide if someone lived or died when the only tools were your hands and the last 60 seconds before the bleeding became a mathematics problem with one answer. The meeting ended. Rachel remained in her seat until the room had cleared, until only the sound of shuffling papers and the air conditioning whisper remained. She stood. Walked toward the elevator. Her steps were precise. The kind of precise that comes from training, from discipline, from having done this exact walk, down a hallway, toward an exit, when the alternative was not walking at all. The elevator doors opened. Ashford was inside. Waiting. She moved to enter. He stepped sideways, blocking the threshold with his shoulder. Close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive, something that cost more than her entire weekly paycheck. You're not understanding the message, he said quietly. His voice had changed. The public performance had ended. This was stage 2, the violence of privacy, the threat delivered where no one could witness the refusal that came next. Temporary staff who don't know their place? They don't last long here, Rachel. Sacred Heart doesn't need maverick nurses who think they're smarter than the attending physician. It needs people who follow protocol. People who know their lane. She could have moved him. Her hands knew exactly where to apply pressure, how much force it would take to make his body comply. But compliance was the strategy. Compliance was the weapon that made her invisible, that let her stay, that kept her close enough to understand what she'd seen in that trauma bay. So instead she waited. Stillness of a held breath. Stillness of a sniper scope. He smiled. I'm going to make sure you understand that. Before you cause real problems. The doors closed. He was gone. The elevator descended without her. She took the stairs. The locker room was empty when she arrived. For in the afternoon, most of the day shift had already cleared out. She had chosen locker number 47 specifically because it was out of sight of the main thoroughfare, a small privacy purchased by obscurity. The door was spray-painted. Red. Aggressive. The kind of red that looked like anger or warning or both. Grunt. For letters that meant everything. She stared at it for 9 seconds. The rage came not as heat but as cold clarity. She could identify the paint, Rust-Oleum, metallic red, approximately for spray cans based on coverage. She could see the pattern of the painter's hand, left-handed, approximately 5'9", applying consistent pressure. She could calculate the timeline, after morning shift, before afternoon. Probably during the 1 hour when the locker room was guaranteed empty because the schedule rotated. She didn't touch the paint. She opened the locker. Her civilian clothes hung there, jeans, a grey sweatshirt, a jacket from a store that didn't exist anymore. On the shelf, a single pair of shoes. Unremarkable. The kind of invisible that came from practice. The supply closet was 5 corridors away. She walked there like a person walking to do their job. Like a person who hadn't just been called a recruit by someone who didn't understand the word. Like a person who didn't have the call sign grunt tattooed on the inside of her left wrist in the same font as the trauma shears she kept in her bag at all times, a gift from the medic who had taken her place, who had trained under her, who was now bleeding in Trauma Bay 3 wearing that exact call sign as his identity. She closed the supply closet door behind her. The shelves held inventory, saline solution in 2-liter bottles, gauze pads in boxes of 200, elastic bandages in various widths, syringes organized by gauge. The fluorescent light above cast everything in a pale, sterilized white. She gripped the edge of the shelf. Her knuckles went white. Whiter than the light. The kind of white that comes from bone pressing through skin, from strength applied against something immovable. She could feel it now. The thing she'd been controlling since the moment she'd seen the Army Ranger's medical ID and recognized the name. John Mercer. Call sign Grunt. The medic who had written her in his journal back in Tikrit as the gunnery sergeant who taught him that steady hands were the difference between someone coming home and someone coming home in a flag-folded box. The memory tried to surface. She pushed it down. Compartmentalization was a skill like anything else. Learned. Practiced. Perfected in places where the alternative was psychological collapse at 2,000 feet in the back of a helicopter, and the team was counting on you to function. She held the shelf until the trembling stopped. Then she let go. At midnight, Dr. Ashford sat in his corner office on the 4th floor with Castleton and Hayes. The door was closed. The 3 of them occupied leather chairs that cost more than entry-level nurses made in 3 months. On Ashford's desk, a tablet glowed with the hospital's staff database. Her previous employers? Ashford asked. Castleton scrolled. Called 3 references from her last position. All very positive. 22 years of nursing experience listed, which is strange for a temp. Mentioned something about prior military experience, but nothing specific. No credentials that would suggest advanced trauma training. Military experience, Ashford repeated. Everyone in Jacksonville has military experience. Exactly, Hayes said. Nothing remarkable. The references were all nurses, no physicians. No one who could actually evaluate her clinical judgment. Here's what we're going to do, Ashford said. He leaned back in his chair. The leather creaked. We bring in an external patient safety consultant. Someone from outside who can review her work without bias. Find someone who specializes in scope of practice violations. Someone who will see what we see. Which is? Castleton asked. A nurse who doesn't understand her limitations. A liability. Ashford pulled up his phone. His contact list was a small network of favors and debts, a landscape he had spent 15 years building. I know someone at Miami Baptist. They brought in a consultant last year after a similar situation. He's good. He sees what you pay him to see. Hayes made a note. Timeline. Fast. Before she settles in. Before she starts asking questions about supply orders or billing. Before she becomes a real problem. Ashford's voice carried the certainty of a man who had never experienced consequences. We document the staff meeting. We note her inability to answer basic clinical questions under pressure. We have the consultant review her charting from last night. And we have documentation that she violated her scope of practice when she tried to practice trauma medicine. The cricothyrotomy, Castleton said. Doesn't matter if it was real. We'll make sure the consultant thinks it was. Ashford smiled. The smile of a man holding all the cards. By the time we're done, Rachel Torres will be too radioactive for any hospital to touch. And our supply chain will be secure. Outside, in the parking garage, Rachel Torres sat in her 10-year-old Honda with the engine off. The steering wheel was cold beneath her forehead. Her hands rested on her thighs. She had been sitting this way for 40 minutes. The parking garage had the particular silence of places designed to contain vehicles, a sound-deadening emptiness that amplified everything happening inside her own head. She could report him. The kickback scheme was real. She had seen the inflated orders, the billing discrepancies, the patterns that didn't make sense unless someone was running inventory through phantom contracts. She could walk into administration and explain what she'd seen in the supply logs and the financial reports that had crossed her desk because she was careful and thorough and no one paid attention to what the temp nurse noticed. But that required staying. That required believing the system would protect her. That required being the kind of person who had faith in the structures that had failed her before, in different ways, in different places where the cost of speaking up was measured in things that didn't fit on incident reports. She thought about the trauma shears in her bag. The ones with the call sign. The ones she'd kept for 7 years because throwing them away felt like throwing away the person who had owned them, the person she'd been before she became the person who could sit in a parking garage with an engine dead and a mind drowning in a field hospital that didn't exist anymore. She didn't turn the key. She couldn't summon the will. And that was when she understood Dr. Ashford had already won. Not because he understood what she was, but because he'd made her invisible in a different way. Not invisible as a weapon. Invisible as erasure. The monitor shrieked at 2:47 a.m. Rachel was charting patient vitals 3 rooms down when the alarm split the silence of Trauma Bay 3 like an axe through ice. She didn't move at first, no one did. Night shift at Sacred Heart was its own kind of quiet, a holding pattern where the chaos slept and the broken people came to rest. But that sound meant rest was over. John Doe seized. His body rigid, arching off the stretcher in a convulsion that pulled at every line running into his arms. The ventilator that had been breathing for him, steady rhythm, the hiss of air escaping with each mechanical breath, suddenly labored. Fought against him. The tube in his throat slipped. Not far. Just enough. Rachel was moving before she'd made the decision to move. The resident on call was 10 minutes out. Maybe less if he drove like someone who understood that the window was closing. The night nurse, Cole, was already at the bedside, hands fumbling with the seizure protocol, trying to push medication through a line while John Doe's body refused to cooperate with anything resembling order. His oxygen saturation dropped as she watched. The numbers on the monitor told the whole story. O2 sat, 86. Dropping. We're losing him, Cole said. His voice cracked somewhere in the middle of the word losing. Young. maybe 2 years out of nursing school. The kind of panic that meant he was doing everything by the book and the book wasn't helping. Rachel stepped into the bay. Not asked permission. Didn't announce herself. Her presence was like pressure changing in a room. The air felt different when she crossed the threshold. She was already pulling a tray. 14-gauge needle on a syringe. The small scalpel glinted under the fluorescent lights. Her hands had the tray assembled before Cole registered that she was there. "Step back," she said. It wasn't a request. The way she said it, flat, no inflection, just a statement of fact, made Cole move without question. 3 steps back. Hands away from the patient. Rachel's jaw worked once. That was the only tell. The only concession her body made to the urgency screaming through her nervous system. She tilted John Doe's head back, located the cricothyroid membrane with her fingertips. Found it like she'd done this 1,000 times. Because she had. Triage protocol. Field triage. The decision tree she'd memorized in a combat support hospital in Tikrit 14 years ago, with IED shrapnel still embedded in the walls around her and people bleeding faster than supplies could replace them. "Passing a tube won't work," she said. Her voice had dropped. Nobody who'd just entered nursing school talked like that, like she was ordering supplies, not saving a life. "We do a cricothyrotomy. Now." Cole stared. "That's not. I'm doing it." Not argued. Not negotiable. She cleaned the site with alcohol wipe. The smell of antiseptic bloomed sharp and clinical in the small space. Her hands moved with the terrifying fluid precision of apex predators, not rushing, not hesitant. Just doing. The scalpel went horizontal through the cricothyroid membrane. Small incision. Controlled. She had the needle catheter positioned before there was blood, before there was any of the chaos that should have come with it. The hiss of air escaping. The ventilator accepted the new airway and John Doe's chest rose. Actually rose, not that struggling lift from before. O2 sat climbed, 68. 75, 82. 88, 92. Stable. The room stayed silent. The kind of silence that comes when 4 people understand that something shifted inside the margins of what just happened. Rachel was adjusting the oxygen flow, securing the catheter with tape from her pocket, tape she'd apparently brought with her, though no one saw her grab it. Her movements were precise as surgery itself. Which, technically, they were. She didn't look up. Didn't make eye contact. Continued working with the composure of someone who'd done this 100 times. 1,000 times. Cole's hands were trembling. "How did you?" "Keep him on the vent. Monitor every 15 minutes. Rachel stepped back from the bed, and the spell broke. She was just a nurse again. Just a temp who'd known what to do when everything went wrong. She peeled off her gloves. "He's stable. Vitals will hold until the resident gets here." Dr. Ashford watched from the doorway. He didn't announce himself. Rachel didn't turn toward him. But she felt his presence the way you feel a predator recognize something dangerous in a crowded room, that shift in air pressure, that recognition of territory being crossed. He'd been walking past. Heading toward the break room or his office or wherever it was he went at 3 in the morning when he should have been asleep. He'd stopped instead. Watched the whole thing. Watched John Doe's oxygen climb and watched Rachel's hands move and watched a seizure resolve because someone had done exactly what the protocol said to do when the protocol changed. Watched her do it. His face had the expression of a man holding a particularly heavy secret. Not shock. Not concern. Just calculation. The way a chess player looks at a board when an opponent makes an unexpected move. She'd just revealed something. Not with words. Not with any announcement or failure of composure. But muscle memory had a language all its own. Rachel stripped the contaminated gloves and disposed of them. Charted the procedure in the system with clinical precision, time, vitals, intervention, outcome. Each notation clean and accurate and defensible. By the book. Except for the part where a civilian nurse wasn't supposed to perform an emergency surgical airway. Except for the part where only a medic, or a physician, or someone with training that went deeper than a civilian nursing degree would typically reach, could have done it that cleanly. The resident arrived 8 minutes later and found John Doe breathing steady, vitals stable, and a patient who would have been dead 20 minutes ago somehow alive. Dr. Ashford had disappeared. Rachel knew, in that place where instinct lived, where 14 years of survival training still fired even in the fluorescent quiet of a civilian trauma bay, that everything had just changed. That moment in the doorway, when he'd seen her hands move with precision that belonged to someone else, somewhere else. That moment was the one that would matter. She finished charting and moved through the rest of the shift like a nurse. Took vitals. Checked lines. Kept patients comfortable. Invisible. The way she'd learned to be. But Cole kept looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite name. Gratitude mixed with something else. Something like fear. The sun was rising over Jacksonville when Rachel clocked out, and her phone had 3 missed calls. Not from the hospital. From Dr. Ashford's office. The third message was different, a voicemail from someone identifying herself as an external patient safety consultant who'd been retained to review the cricothyrotomy from this morning and needed to schedule a formal interview regarding scope of practice violations and the necessity of institutional review. She hadn't even made it to her car. The voicemail played again. Dr. Ashford's voice was professional, almost cheerful as he explained that an external patient safety consultant had been retained, not requested, to review the cricothyrotomy procedure from this morning. Scope of practice violations required institutional scrutiny. The consultant would be contacting her within the hour. Rachel deleted the message and sat in the hospital corridor for exactly 7 seconds before standing up to finish her charting. By noon, the consultant had arrived. Her name was Margaret Voss, and she wore the kind of expression that came preloaded with conclusions. Ashford had walked her directly to Rachel's workstation, standing close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and aggressive that made her think of a predator marking territory. Voss spent 40 minutes reviewing the procedure notes, asking Rachel technical questions that were framed as inquiry but functioned as accusation. Walk me through your decision-making here. Why did you proceed without physician oversight? Rachel's voice remained level. The patient was losing his airway. No physician was available. Voss wrote something down. Rachel couldn't see what. The room had that particular density it gets when someone is building a case against you, when the questions are just theater and the verdict is already written in permanent ink somewhere behind closed eyes. At 1:15 p.m., her phone buzzed. An email from Human Resources requesting her presence in Administrator Bennett's office at 3 p.m. Not a request. The language was precise. There was no room for negotiation in a summons written at 1:15 p.m. for a 3 p.m. meeting. But before that, Ashford had made 3 phone calls. The first was to St. Luke's Medical Center in San Antonio, where Rachel had worked for 18 months before moving to Jacksonville. He spoke to a supervisor who had never actually supervised Rachel but had opinions about her nonetheless. Does she have a pattern of overstepping her scope? Ashford asked. The supervisor, not wanting to seem unprepared, agreed that yes, there had been concerns. Nothing documented, of course, but concerns. Ashford thanked him and moved on. The second call was to Methodist Hospital in Dallas, where Rachel had spent for years. This supervisor knew Rachel better, remembered her fondly, but Ashford had a gift for framing questions so that yes meant no and hesitation meant guilt. Would you say she was prone to acting independently in high-stress situations? Of course, every nurse acted somewhat independently in high-stress situations. That was the definition of high-stress situations. But the way Ashford had asked it made it sound like recklessness. Like a pattern. The supervisor, caught between honesty and the desire to be helpful, gave an answer that Ashford could later describe as problematic in her background. The third call was to a peer review consultant at the State Medical Board, someone Ashford had golfed with in April. No formal complaint was being filed, he explained. But there might be questions. Voss would need to be thorough. Ashford could assure him that the staff at Sacred Heart took patient safety very seriously and wouldn't want to shield anyone who had overstepped. The consultant agreed. Professional courtesy, Ashford called it. By 2:45 p.m., Rachel walked into Administrator Bennett's office. The room smelled like expensive leather and the air conditioning had been turned up high enough to make the windows sweat. Bennett sat behind a desk that cost more than most people made in a month, flanked by Voss on one side and two board members Rachel had seen in the hospital but never spoken to, Richard Harwell, who owned a string of urgent care clinics, and Janet Morrison, whose husband ran a pharmaceutical distribution company. All of them had golfed with Ashford. Rachel knew this the way soldiers know things, by reading the air, by understanding power dynamics, by watching who stood near whom. Bennett opened a folder. He didn't smile. We've received concerns about your actions this morning in Trauma Bay 3. Multiple sources have indicated a pattern of scope violations and judgment issues. The patient safety consultant has recommended we initiate a full investigation. Rachel's jaw tightened fractionally. Her hands remained folded in her lap. The patient's airway collapsed. There was no physician available. That's precisely the problem, Voss interjected. Her voice was smooth as silk over broken glass. You had no authority to perform that procedure. A cricothyrotomy is not within the scope of nursing practice. You created significant liability for this institution. The patient would have died, Rachel said. That decision wasn't yours to make, Harwell added, leaning back in his chair with the posture of someone accustomed to being right. You exceeded your authority. Significantly. Silence. The fluorescent lights in the hallway outside hummed their mechanical song. Rachel could hear a nurse paging someone over the intercom. She could hear the distant sound of a stretcher being wheeled, wheels squeaking on tile. She did not respond because there was nothing to say to people who had already decided. Bennett slid a document across the desk. Her termination letter. Effective immediately. We're going to need your badge and your hospital credentials. We'll have security escort you to your locker to collect your personal effects. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Rachel picked up the termination letter. The word swam a moment before her vision steadied. Gross violation of scope of practice. Failure to adhere to institutional protocols. Risk to patient safety. The signature lines were already filled in, Ashford's name on top, the others beneath. They had signed it before she even walked into the room. The verdict had been written in permanent ink. She stood. Removed her badge from her scrub pocket. Placed it on the desk with the kind of precision that suggested she was placing a weapon down very carefully. The patient in Trauma Bay 3, she said quietly. Is he awake? That's not your concern anymore, Bennett said. His eyes were already on his next task, his attention already moved on. Rachel turned and walked out. A security guard was waiting in the hallway. He looked uncomfortable. She knew this expression. He was someone who didn't like his job but had been told to do his job anyway. She walked with him to the nursing station, where the staff had gone very still. Conversation stopped. Eyes looked away. The universal language of people witnessing something they couldn't stop or prevent. Her locker was in the break room. The security guard waited outside while she opened it. Her spare stethoscope hung on the inside of the door. A sweater she'd left in January and forgotten about. A photograph from 3 years ago showing her and a nurse named Carmen at the beach, both of them laughing about something that felt like it belonged to a different lifetime. And in the bottom, beneath a folded spare pair of scrubs, the trauma shears. Combat-grade titanium, the metal worn smooth from 1,000 field operations. The call sign engraved on the handle, White Witch in precise military block letters, caught the light. She stared at those shears for a long moment. The person who had carried them through 3 tours of Afghanistan, through the streets of Fallujah, through 100 moments where steady hands were the difference between lives saved and lives lost, that person felt very distant. That person had chosen to be someone else. That person had chosen safety and invisibility and the quiet rhythm of civilian nursing, had genuinely wanted to live a life where the worst thing that happened was a difficult patient or a long shift. The shears went into her bag along with the photograph and the sweater. The security guard drove her to the parking garage in the hospital's south tower. It was raining, not the gentle spring rain that feels like possibility, but the heavy, sullen rain that sounds like punishment. The kind of rain that has opinions. Rachel sat in her car in Space G47, engine off, forehead pressed against the steering wheel. The key was in her pocket. She had no idea how to turn it. The silence in the car was absolute. Not peaceful. Absolute. The kind of silence that comes when everything you've carefully constructed decides to collapse simultaneously. Dr. Ashford had won. He had manufactured a pattern and summoned witnesses and built a case so airtight that even the patient's survival couldn't pierce it. She had saved a man's life and it had cost her everything, her job, her references, her carefully maintained anonymity. Her hand shook. Not from fear. From the kind of rage that soldiers understand, the kind that comes from knowing you fought by the rules and the enemy didn't, and the enemy won because of it. She gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles went white. The rain hammered against the windshield with sounds like static. Like the world was trying to drown her. In her bag, the trauma shears rested against her cardigan. The call sign stared upward, White Witch. It was a name from a different life. A name from a woman who had learned that staying quiet was the only way to survive. Keep your head down, do the work, never let anyone know what you're actually capable of. But that strategy had failed. She had saved a man's life with the precision of a gunnery sergeant and it had taken her career. Staying quiet hadn't saved her. It had only delayed the moment when the wrong person noticed what her hands could do. Rachel sat in that car for 2 hours. The rain didn't stop. Her phone showed 3 missed calls from an unknown number and a voicemail she didn't have the will to listen to. She counted her savings in her head, $1,847 in checking, maybe $4,200 if she emptied her emergency fund. Enough for a month of an apartment if she found something very small and very cheap. Enough for interviews and gas and the kind of life where you didn't ask for much because you couldn't afford much. The shears were still in her bag. She almost threw them out the window into the rain. Almost let them disappear into the parking garage like everything else had disappeared. Then she heard it. A sound in the distance, carried on the wind and the rain. Not the sound of a car. Not the sound of an ambulance. The sound of helicopter rotors, growing louder, cutting through the rain like something impossible breaking through the clouds. And somewhere in the hospital, in the ICU where they'd moved him after the surgery, John Mercer opened his eyes for the first time since the car accident had crushed his chest, and asked the nurse standing beside his bed a single question that would change everything. Where is she? Where is the nurse who saved me? 3 days later, the hospital erupted. The afternoon shift was routine, equipment humming, monitors beeping their steady rhythm, nurses moving between rooms with the practiced efficiency of people who've learned to find peace in chaos. Rachel had been home, sitting in her apartment with the lights off, staring at the trauma shears on her kitchen counter. The engraved call sign caught the grey light from the window, breaker. Not her call sign. Someone else's. Someone else's war. Her phone rang at 2:47 p.m. It was Maria from the ICU. Rachel? You need to come back. Now. Something's happening. She didn't ask questions. She grabbed her jacket and drove in silence. The moment she stepped into the hospital, she heard it, screaming in Arabic, raw and desperate, coming from the 3rd floor. Her jaw tightened fractionally. The sound of a man breaking. She knew that sound. Had heard it in Tikrit when families found their missing relatives alive. The emergency stairwell door was closer than the elevator. Her legs moved on instinct. The screaming grew louder as she climbed. 2 security guards stood outside a patient room, hands up, confused. Inside, a man was on his knees at the foot of his bed, tears streaming down his weathered face, pointing at her with both hands shaking. His left arm ended at the wrist, an old amputation, scarred tissue tight and white. His eyes were the color of burnt earth. The angel of Tikrit, he kept saying, over and over, in Arabic. You're alive. You're alive. You saved us. You pulled us from the rubble. I remember your hands. I remember your voice. Allah blessed us. Allah blessed us. 2 translators were already rushing down the hallway. Rachel's throat tightened, not a visible flinch, just a slight catch of breath that lasted exactly 1 second. She stood completely still, hands at her sides, while the man on his knees wept the kind of tears that come from surviving something impossible. The nurses were staring. The security guards were staring. The entire floor went so quiet you could hear the ventilator wheeze from the room beside him. That was when John Mercer's daughter came running past the translators, a girl no older than 12 with her father's dark eyes and a confusion written across her face that said she understood something fundamental had just shifted. She stopped directly in front of Rachel, and in the clear voice children use when they're asking questions adults are afraid to answer, she said, "Are you really a gunnery sergeant?" The room went dead silent. Rachel looked down at the girl. Just looked. No words. The silence lasted 3 seconds. Then the floor nurse, Hannah, one of the ones who'd avoided Rachel's eyes at her firing, came rushing out of the medication station with a file in her hands, trembling visibly. The tremor in her fingers was so pronounced she nearly dropped the papers. I accessed the federal database through the patient's VA file, Hannah whispered, her voice barely audible. Your service record. Rachel, she couldn't finish. Just stood there, hand shaking, holding the proof of everything Rachel had never told anyone. The sound of footsteps. Heavy boots on tile. 1, 2, 3, 4. A man in dress blues rounded the corner, shoulders wider than doorways, chest covered in ribbons, face like someone who'd seen things that couldn't be unseen. A SEAL team leader. Rachel recognized the bearing immediately. He stopped mid-stride when he saw her, and his entire body went rigid. Gunnery Sergeant Torres, he said, and his voice carried the weight of a courtroom verdict. Bronze Star with Valor. He paused. The hallway held its breath. Purple Heart. Another pause, longer this time. Nurses frozen in place. Monitors beeping their indifferent rhythm. Combat Medical Badge. He stepped closer, and his next words were spoken so quietly they seemed to echo. And a Navy Cross. 18 months of service before your team hit that IED in Sanjin Valley, Helmand Province. You kept 5 Marines alive who should have died. That's not a rumor, Gunnery Sergeant. That's documented fact. Rachel's jaw remained completely still. Her hands didn't tremble. Her breathing didn't change. But something in her eye shifted, just a fraction, a door opening that had been locked for years. The SEAL leader wasn't finished. You extracted 847 civilians from a collapsed building in Tikrit. 17 of them were on the terrorist watch list, intelligence assets we couldn't get to because the insurgency had them. You got them out with 2 medics and nothing but trauma shears and a conviction that people shouldn't die on your watch. That operation disrupted a cell that was planning attacks on the Green Zone. You're the reason half those people are alive right now. 2 FBI agents appeared at the top of the stairwell, badges already visible, boots loud on the stairs. They came directly toward her, moving with the precision of federal authority. Gunnery Sergeant Rachel Torres, the first one said. Not a question. We're here conducting a federal investigation into witness protection breaches. This patient was marked for Level 6 security redaction. The fact that his identity and location was compromised by hospital personnel requires, he stopped. Looked at her. His eyes widened fractionally. You're the medic from the Tikrit extraction. The one in the file. Rachel said nothing. Her composure was absolute. A statue. A wall. Everything she'd been trained to be. The second agent stepped forward. Dr. Ashford has been informed that this hospital is now under federal audit for financial fraud, insurance irregularities, and deliberate falsification of medical records related to supply chain billing. His suspension is effective immediately pending criminal investigation. The military authority on site is overriding all civilian personnel decisions as of, he checked his watch, 1,303 hours. That was when Dr. Ashford appeared around the corner, coming from his office. He stopped. He looked at Rachel. He looked at the seal. He looked at the federal agents and their badges and the military uniform with more ribbons than he'd seen in his entire life, and his entire face drained of color so thoroughly it was like watching someone's soul leave their body. The hallway erupted. A 2-star general from Naval Hospital Jacksonville arrived unannounced, moving like someone accustomed to crowds parting. He walked directly past Dr. Ashford without acknowledging him and stood beside Rachel with his hands clasped behind his back. Gunnery Sergeant Torres, this hospital's administration has conducted itself in a manner inconsistent with military support protocols. Effective immediately, you are no longer terminated. Your medical credentials are reinstated. And Dr. Ashford is relieved of his duties pending federal investigation and possible criminal charges. He turned to face Dr. Ashford directly. You may collect your personal items and leave the facility. You are not to speak to patients, staff, or visitors. Do you understand me? Dr. Ashford opened his mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. His hand started shaking, visible tremors, the kind that come from everything you've built collapsing in real time. Sir, I was simply following protocol. I was conducting a necessary peer review. His voice was climbing, becoming desperate. She performed a procedure outside her scope of practice. That's documented. That's in the record. You fabricated that record, the general said quietly. Federal auditors have already identified the pattern. Inflated supply orders totaling $847,000 in kickback arrangements with 3 vendors. Your personal cell phone records show contact with 2 hospital board members on the same days you initiated action against this nurse. You weren't following protocol. You were executing a cover-up. And now you're doing it in front of federal agents and military command structure, which makes it a criminal act. A local news crew, they'd been filming a community health segment in the lobby that morning, came running upstairs with their camera, and every moment of Dr. Ashford's face draining completely of color was captured in perfect 4K detail. The way his mouth opened silently. The way his hands came up as if to shield himself from truth that was already written. The way his legs seemed to forget how to hold his weight. You need to leave, the general said. Now. Dr. Ashford left. The nurses watched him go, watched him walk toward the elevator with the news camera following him like a predator that had finally caught its prey. Nobody said anything. The silence was the kind that comes after something breaks. Federal auditors arrived before the shift change with boxes of files and court-ordered access to the hospital's entire supply chain database. Within 48 hours, they'd identified $2.3 million in fraudulent billing across 6 years of Dr. Ashford's tenure. The board members he'd golfed with began lawyering up. The vendors cut deals. The pattern was so obvious once you knew to look for it that everyone asked the same question: how had no one noticed before? The answer was sitting alone in the trauma bay, charting vitals on a patient who'd been coded twice and was now breathing steadily, color returning to his face. Rachel moved through the hospital like she'd moved through Tikrit, hands steady, orders precise, and something in her presence that made people listen. The timid temp nurse was gone. In her place stood someone with 12 years of field medicine, 847 lives saved, and a Navy Cross that stayed in a drawer at home because she'd never wanted the attention. John Mercer woke up completely on day 4 post-op. His daughter was asleep in the chair beside his bed, her hand wrapped around his. He looked at Rachel standing in his doorway, doing her final vitals check, and something shifted in his expression. You saved me, he said. Just like you saved the others. In Tikrit. Rachel checked his O2 Saturday. 97. Stable. Perfect. You're not special, she said quietly. You just got the same care everyone deserves. And then you got lucky. She made a note on his chart. You're cleared for physical therapy tomorrow. After that, you're going to spend 6 months relearning how to walk with a titanium femur, and then you're going to spend the rest of your life grateful that you got the chance. The trauma shears, John said. The ones with my call sign. I got them back. Cleaned them up. I want you to have them. He held up a small box. Inside was the instrument, polished until it gleamed, and a note written in John's careful handwriting, for the one who taught me what steady hands really mean. Rachel picked it up. Held it in the light. The call sign breaker was etched in military spec marking. She'd worked with a breaker in Kandahar. A young Marine with 3 bullet holes in his kit and absolute conviction that his job was to keep his squad alive. She wondered if that was the same one. She made no move to take the box. Just stood there, holding the shears as if they might tell her something about the cost of hiding who you were. The hospital board announced reforms 3 weeks later, a new veteran services clinic, pro bono trauma care for active duty and retired military, and a zero-tolerance policy for financial manipulation. Rachel was offered the position of director. She turned it down. She wanted to be back in scrubs, with a stethoscope around her neck and actual patients to see, not paperwork to sign. She wanted her fight to be here, in the rooms where people were scared and bleeding and needed someone who knew what to do when the system broke down. On her first day back at work, a patient came in with a gunshot wound to the lower abdomen. Intern panicked. Resident froze. The trauma surgeon on call was 3 minutes out. Rachel didn't wait. She moved to the bedside, hands already moving, and said 3 words that had his full attention: move. Now. She stabilized the bleed with a Reboa balloon catheter placed with a 12-gauge needle, and the patient lived. The intern watched her with something like awe. The resident looked ashamed. The trauma surgeon arrived and found everything already done, everything already perfect, and nodded once, like he understood exactly who was standing in his trauma bay. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. That's what it always had been. Every moment she'd stood silent while Dr. Ashford screamed at her. Every moment she'd kept her hand steady while her world fell apart. Every moment she'd hidden who she was under a name and a nursing license and the determination to be just another person. The trembling that people mistook for weakness was actually her own power, held back, controlled, waiting for the exact moment when it would be needed. The trauma shears with the call sign breaker sat in a shadow box on her office wall now, because the hospital had insisted she take the director position after all, just with a different title, trauma medicine lead. The shears caught the light from her window, and sometimes when she was looking at them, she thought about all the lives that had passed through her hands. 847. Not that she was counting. But she was. And she would. For the rest of her life. Scars tell stories. And hers had just begun to be told. If you've been underestimated by someone who didn't know your value, if you've ever hidden who you really were to survive, if you've ever wondered what happens when the world finally sees what you've been hiding all along, hit subscribe. Hit like. Tell me in the comments, would you have saved him, or would you have walked away?